Well, we now move on to our final speaker today. So Dr. Papatheodorou has just finished her doctorate from the University of Oxford, and she's done fascinating work on tracing the roots of really everything we're talking about today, in many ways, the relationship between the Turkish state, Turkish society, and the archaeological heritage. And so we look forward to her paper now, analysing this, please.
Well, good afternoon. I would like to thank the organisers of this conference, and particularly Dr. Shankland, for inviting me to deliver this paper on the way the Ottomans treated antiquities in their lands and how their successors in early Republican Turkey may have differed. For the most part, my analysis will follow the Ottoman regulations and antiquity in an attempt to understand their content and function. The Ottoman state promulgated its first regulation on antiquities in 1869. As seen in its preamble, the regulation reflected an increased awareness about the value of antiquity and its remains, and an interest in their contemporary use. In particular, the empire wished to introduce a system for managing antiquities that would allow it to enrich its museum, established already in 1845, also by way of catching up with other countries endowed with archaeological museums. The regulation was thought to introduce a more complete regulatory framework than what the empire could refer to up to that point, in written form, and was expected to ensure respect for the principles that it enshrined. The specific content of the regulation, though, evolved from Ottoman concerns with goods activities, excavations at Ephesus. In 1868, alerted by the way finds were being exported from the site, the governor of Aydın, Hekim Basha Ismail Pasha, submitted a report to the Council of State with his views and suggestions on this matter. Following a process that included deliberations by the Public Works Commission of the Council of State, the Council of State itself, and the approval of the Sultan, the regulation appeared in the official gazette Takvimi Vekayi on 13 February 1869. It consisted of 7 articles that dealt with the authorization to excavate, the export, trade and ownership of finds, and heritage protection, while designating the authority in charge of its implementation. The regulation stipulated that official permission was required to conduct an excavation, and designated the Ministry of Public Education as the authority responsible for dealing with such requests. Yet, authorization could be issued only with regards to antiquities to be found underground. The regulation banned any intervention to antiquities to be found overground, and thus introduced an element of heritage protection. Also, it prohibited the export of antiquities except for coin finds. Unlike exports, trade in antiquities within the Ottoman Empire was permitted, with the state enjoying priority in case it expressed its interest in purchasing a find. Significantly, the regulation acknowledged full ownership for landowners regarding all finds discovered in their lands. And interestingly, it also invited specialists who wished to conduct archaeological research on behalf of the Ottoman state to apply. Now, whereas these provisions introduced an elementary system of handling archaeological research in the empire, another provision introduced a legal way for circumventing this system, by stipulating that official requests by foreign powers would be dealt by the Sultan, as they would be subject to special imperial permission. By putting on paper a pattern which was well known to both delegations and the Ottoman authorities already from the previous decades, this provision formalized the regular intervention of embassies on behalf of their citizens. Although this arrangement has been castigated in literature for creating a loophole for bypassing the regulation and for allowing political considerations to affect authorization for archaeological research, a study of the implementation of the regulation shows that this provision also created a window of opportunity for the Ottomans to introduce standards, processes and practices more advantageous to their interests than the ones the 1869 regulation afforded them. Archival sources document the introduction of a system of monitoring excavations, as well as a system for the sharing of fines and the imposition of time limits to permits, that is, practices that were not included in the regulation. Now, the regulation of 1869 introduced the first Ottoman legal framework for the management of antiquities. More activities in these years would aim at supporting the central institution of Ottoman archaeology, namely the museum. For example, the Minister of Public Education, Safvet Pasha, issued a series of official requests to the provinces for the collection of antiquities for the museum. Also, Ottoman officials, especially the director of the Imperial Museum, Edward Gould, became engaged to archaeological research in places outside of Istanbul. A more complete set of provisions was adopted in 1874. This new regulation was the work of the director of the Imperial Museum, Dr. De Thier, who considered the 1869 regulation a major impediment to the development of the museum he headed. The new regulation contained a total of 36 articles arranged in 6 parts. Through this regulation, Dr. De Thier primarily wished to protect antiquities against loss. And this may explain the pain he took at regulating archaeological matters, especially excavations, in great detail, so much so that Shah compares the regulation with administrative circulars, yönetmelik, that deal with the implementation of laws rather than with laws that set regulatory frameworks. The introductory clauses provided the first Ottoman legal definition of antiquities, which covered, and I quote, all kinds of works of art dating from ancient times. The first chapter dealt mainly with the right of possession and the sharing of fines. For example, it declared that all antiquities to be discovered belonged to the Ottoman state. It clarified, though, that in case of authorized excavations, the fines would be equally divided between the state, the excavator, and the landowner. The second chapter covered archaeological research and excavations, and with 18 articles in total out of 36, contained the largest number of provisions. It regulated research and excavations in a detailed manner. The registry book of fines, the warranty required for authorization, the duration of permits and their extension, etc. The third chapter covered the obligation to inform the authorities in case of archaeological finds and provided more details regarding the sharing of fines. The fourth chapter covered the import, export, purchase and sale of antiquities, as well as cases of no declaring fines. The regulation concluded with 2 articles. One that banned the complete or partial destruction of antiquities, whether in public or private lands, and another one that listed the sources that would be tapped for financing the Imperial Museum. Archival documents present a mixed picture as to the consistent and uniform implementation of the new regulation. In spite of these mixed results, though, the Ottoman administration attempted repeatedly to improve the content of the regulation and its enforcement. For example, already in August 1874, that is only a few months after the promulgation of the regulation, a new official order came to reinforce the regulation as regards the preservation of monuments. It was based on the observation that rare works in old and famous cities were being destroyed for their parts to be used as construction material, and highlighted the need for care and vigilance with a view to preventing such damage and destruction. The Imperial Museum also merits reference for having promoted its institutional role in those years. It continued to sponsor a system of collecting antiquities through local agents. Notably, the collection of antiquities housed in Hagia Irene was transferred to another building in its vicinity, the tiled pavilion, the Çinili Köşk, upon a request by Dr. De Thier dated in 1875. Following its restoration, the new museum building was inaugurated in 1880 with the Minister of Public Education, Munif Pasha, expressing in his speech his satisfaction at, and I quote, the opening of a museum in Istanbul similar to those in other civilized countries. Significantly, in those years, at the initiative of Osman Hamdi Bey, the Ottoman intellectual and statesman who in 1881 succeeded Dr. Dithier at the helm of the Imperial Museum, the Ottoman state would carry out its first systematic excavations. The beginning appears to have been done with Demosthenes Baltadzi, who conducted excavations in Eolis in western Anatolia in 1883. Also in that year, Osman Hamdi Bey led the first Ottoman archaeological expedition to Mount Nemrut in southeastern Anatolia, where he discovered the tumulus of Antiochus, an important archaeological breakthrough which he described in a detailed publication. The adoption of a new regulation, the third set of provision on antiquities in February 1884, comes as little surprise given the widespread dissatisfaction with the content and the implementation of the 1874 regulation. For example, the Ottoman government would argue that, and I quote, "In Europe such explorers of antiquities can only make one plaster copy of each type of ancient work that they bring to light, and leave the originals to the local museums. For this reason, there is the need of a law that from now on will ensure that those interested in conducting excavations in Turkey will only be given one copy per find, and the originals will be handed over to the Imperial Museum." The 1884 regulation comprised 5 chapters and a total of 37 articles and exhibited the same structure as the 1874 regulation. The main differences between the two regulations, the one of 1884 and its predecessor of 1874, focused on the fundamental concepts of ownership, sharing of finds, and their export. Whereas according to the 1874 regulation, the state was entitled to all antiquities that lay underground and were not yet discovered, but gave room to the sharing of finds in authorized excavations, the 1884 regulation put forth the concept of complete state ownership of all antiquities, including finds in authorized excavations. The rights of the excavator were limited to making copies, moulage, and drawings. Similarly, exports of antiquities discovered in the empire would no longer be permitted, unlike in the regulation of 1874. Now, besides such interplay between the two regulations, the Ottoman Empire was able to draw from the laws of other countries in drafting its own regulation. Although Salomon Reynaud's exclamation that the Ottomans, and I quote, simply reproduced with insignificant modifications the restrictive and prohibitive laws applied in Greece for more than half a century, unquote, would be misleading in its wholesale approach of the sources of Ottoman legislation, some of the provisions of the new regulation were indeed based on the Greek law of 1834. For example, Article 5 of the Ottoman regulation of 1884, which dealt with the protection of monuments, was to a large extent a translation of Article 85 of the Greek law of 1834. Scholars appear to agree that the implementation of the 1884 regulation remained a sought-after goal for the Ottomans. Indeed, one can identify various factors that disturbed the smooth implementation of the 1884 regulation. Budgetary issues hindered the effective monitoring of sites and affected the collection of antiquities. Also, the Ottoman authorities had considerable difficulties with combating illegal digs and, in consequence, controlling a flourishing black market in antiquities in the vast expanse of the empire. Moreover, local populations continued to use ancient sites as sources of reconstruction material. High politics only coupled these factors in undermining the proper implementation of the 1884 regulation. The way that the Sultan exercised his prerogatives illustrates this well, with geopolitical considerations weighing heavily in bypassing the 1884 regulation. Against this backdrop, there was little one could achieve if they were to attempt to address these issues in a direct, legalistic, let alone confrontational manner. The system for the protection of antiquities in the empire could better be strengthened through measures at the institutional level, including strengthening the institutional capacity of the state. The expansion of the Imperial Museum, as well as the creation of local museums, provided the Ottoman state with significantly more space for exhibiting antiquities. Besides improving their infrastructure, the Ottomans also aimed at improving their operational capacity in archaeological matters. They attempted to do so in partnership with European experts, as well as through harnessing their own resources. The Imperial Museum systematically relied on a small number of French and other European archaeologists to develop its capacity in the capital and the provinces. The museum would hire them to provide for the arrangement of its collections, the publication of catalogues and, broadly speaking, the formation of its staff, as well as to conduct excavations and enrich its collections. Among them, one finds Salomon Reynard, André Joubin, Jean-Vincent Scheil and Gustave Mendel, as well as Orientalist and diplomat Johann Heinrich Mordmann. Significantly, foreigners conducting excavations would provide peer learning opportunities to members of the museum staff. Self-taught archaeologist and numismatist Theodore Macready of the Imperial Museum is a case in point. For example, in Saida, between 1903 and 1904, he had the opportunity to work with one of the best German archaeologists of his time, Hugo Winkler. The first regulation dealing with the internal operations of the Imperial Museum merits special reference. It was introduced in 1889 and appears to have much contributed to the operational capacity of the museum. It provided a description of the positions and corresponding duties from the museum director and the departmental curators to the museum accountant and gardeners, and brings to mind a modern organizational charter. This internal regulation went beyond tidying up the operations of the Imperial Museum and included more visionary clauses that covered issues such as the appointment of museum curators to excavations around the country and the establishment of local museums. Moreover, modern technologies were officially put at the service of the Imperial Museum in this internal regulation. A photography and a modeling studio, as well as a conservation laboratory, Ameliat Khaneh in the original, were created with their staff being directly accountable to the museum director. Reproduction technology was important in the effort of the museum to maintain ownership of finds by providing copies to interested parties, and thus curbing their wish to acquire the original. Also to raise funds, for example through the sale of photographs of exhibits, and together with a conservation laboratory to preserve the archaeological wealth of the empire. Overall, by positioning the museum at the center of the day-to-day management of antiquities in the empire, far from being a simple internal document regulating the operation of a museum, this regulation aspired to turn the Imperial Museum into the de facto antiquity service of the Ottoman state. In many respects, the regulation of 1906 followed the regulation of 1884, whereas in other aspects it introduced changes and new elements. The two regulations shared a number of core principles. For example, they both acknowledged full state ownership of antiquities and both listed the same prohibitions with a view to protecting antiquities. The changes and new ideas introduced are of particular importance and point to the reasons for the adoption of this new regulation. Administrative reasons are behind a number of shifts. Already in its first articles, the regulation of 1906 introduced a new system for the administration of archaeological affairs, which practically created, following the 1889 internal regulation of the museum, an antiquities service around the museum. Numerous provisions streamlined the regulation with reality on the ground, as well as with developments in archaeology as a field of scholarship and scientific research. For example, the new law made a distinction between excavations, sondage or trial trenches, and surface research, whereas all previous regulations had treated them all in the same manner. The addition of Islamic arts and crafts in the definition of antiquities confirmed the gradual shift in the self-identification of the empire. The collection of items that pertain to Islamic arts and crafts had been included in the mandate of the Imperial Museum already from 1889, as seen in the museum regulation that dedicated an entire department to Islamic arts. Although the way the Imperial Museum had enacted its collections policy had relegated Islamic artifacts to a secondary position, The fact that Islamic antiquities were included in the new regulation sealed the acknowledgement of these artifacts as valued objects from the past worthy of protection. And significantly, the new regulation did not simply list Islamic antiquities among other ancient artifacts in Article 5. It also made special reference to them in Article 4, where it clarified that the stipulations of this article, they mean the law, are equally applicable to all ancient objects, mobile or immobile, that pertain to Islamic arts and crafts. By not extending this special reference to Christian and Jewish antiquities, which were included as examples in the list of Article 5, the lawmakers singled out Islam and its heritage in a way that reflected its elevated position in the self-identification of the state. And interestingly, this first in an Ottoman regulation specific reference to Islamic antiquities was an adaptation of a paragraph from the Greek law of 1899, where the Greek law made reference to early Christianity and medieval Hellenism. The Ottoman law spoke of Islamic antiquities. Now, in those years, old issues continued to cause complications to archaeological management in the empire. In addition to these, increased pressure for the demolition of monuments at a time of rapid urban modernization forced the Ottoman authorities in charge of antiquities to take action. A draft version of the regulation on the preservation of monuments, dated in 1912, survives in the Ottoman archive in Istanbul. The 1912 regulation focused on ensuring the preservation of monuments by creating checks and balances for their demolition in the provinces. It introduced a request for documentation, moved decision-making from the local level to the central level, and tied it to scientific expertise, be that of engineers and/or experts on antiquities. Moreover, it introduced the idea of salvaging heritage through documenting monuments and even removing or replicating parts of edifices. Following the rise of the Young Turks in power in 1908, heritage management became increasingly oriented towards the protection of Islamic and Turkish artifacts and monuments. During the First World War and its aftermath, this was often combined with the mushrooming of special bodies in charge of heritage management. A first such indication of a greater interest in Islamic antiquities came in 1908, when after years of display at a corner in the upper floor of the museum, the Islamic collection of the Imperial Museum acquired its own space at the tiled pavilion. A few years later, in 1914, a separate museum, the Islamic Endowments Museum, was established. Now, with the exception of the war years, when the territorial and political fluidity created a state of emergency in the Ottoman administration of antiquities, overall, developing the capacity of the Ottoman state with regards to archaeological management continued during this period. In terms of infrastructure, the Imperial Museum was expanded with the addition of another wing that was completed in 1908. Although the war would undermine their realization, the establishment of local museums in Salonika, Sivas and Smyrna was anticipated. As before the adoption of the 1906 regulation, in some of the few excavations that the Imperial Museum was able to carry out before the outbreak of war, collaboration with foreign experts continued. In a most impressive example of their strong wish to develop the legal framework on antiquities, the Ottoman authorities in charge pushed for the adoption of a new law in 1921. Generally, the draft law of 1921 combined in one text the regulation of 1906 and the regulation for the preservation of antiquities adopted in 1912. It did not go through. Thus, it would be the regulation of 1906 that the Turkish Republic would inherit and keep in force for a number of years. The fact that the authorities in the Republican period maintained the Ottoman regulation on antiquities and the administration on antiquities as delineated in this regulation was complemented by continuity in the field of history teaching. For nearly a decade, schools in Turkey used the same history textbooks as in the late Ottoman period. The Büyük Tarihi Umumi of the Ottomans, refashioned as Umumi Tarih, was the book sanctioned for teaching at schools. Let's have a look at Near Eastern history as presented in this book. We will need it for what we are going to discuss. The relevant sections focused on Egypt, Assyria, Chaldea, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, the Iranians, and the Jews. On the Hittites in particular, the book commented that although they had been assumed to be of Turanian descent, deciphering their script had shown that they were actually not of Turanian origin, even though they had migrated to Anatolia from Asia. This textbook was reprinted as late as 1928, but not long afterwards some of its basic premises would become outdated for Republican Turkey. Why? In 1930, there was established the Turkish Historical Research Society, the Türk Tarihi Tetkik Cemiyeti, as part of the Turkish House, the Türk Ocakları, whose mandate was already from late Ottoman times, and I quote, to develop and spread an understanding of Turkish identity, unquote. Re-established in 1935 under the name Turkish History Association, the famous Türk Tarih Kurumu, the society, or association, was tasked by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to answer the following questions. Who were the indigenous people of Turkey? Who established the first civilization in Turkey and how? What is the role of Turks in the history of world civilizations? The Turks' success in Anatolia cannot be explained by basing it on the legendary tribal story of the SOAS Turks. Accordingly, a different explanation is necessary to explain the formation of state in Anatolia. And finally, what is the real identity of Islam? What was the role of Turks in the history of Islam? Now, within a few months, the society, which comprised influential historians, bureaucrats, and ideologues such as Yusuf Akçura and Afet İnan, produced a voluminous book titled The Main Tenets of Turkish History, Türk Tarihinin Ana Hatları. In it, the Turks were presented as a brachycephalic race, that is, similar to the European races, originally from Central Asia, where they had developed an advanced civilization. Due to a drought, the thesis continued, the Turks migrated in waves from their ancestral lands in Central Asia and brought civilization to practically the rest of the world. The Chinese to the east, India to the south, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, Anatolia, Greece, and even Italy to the west. As a result of these prehistoric migrations, the Turks came to inhabit permanently Anatolia, turning it into their second homeland. Therefore, the Turkish history thesis concluded the Turks were at the roots of all civilizations, ancient and modern. About 100 copies of the main tenets of Turkish history were distributed to established Turkish intellectuals and academics, but this did not extend the support to the thesis that the society had anticipated. A concise version, the introduction to the main tenets of Turkish history, the Türk Tarihinin Ana Hatları, Methal Kısmı, was produced in some 30,000 copies in 1931 and distributed to middle and high schools. The first Congress of the Society, organized in 1932, was attended mostly by middle and high school teachers, allowing thus the Society to consolidate its thesis among this important segment of the population. However, certain academics remained reluctant to accept the thesis' main components. For example, Fuat Köprülü, a well-known history professor at Istanbul University, cast a doubt on the prehistoric roots of the Turks. It was clear that more was needed to win over these erudites. What could offer the strongest proof was no other than the discipline of archaeology with its positivistic outlook. Up to that point, Republican Anatolia had seen few excavations, and mostly by foreigners working on classical periods. As of 1933, there started a new era in Republican history. As Atakuman lets us know, teams of young Turkish archaeologists with nationalist proclivities, such as Hamid Zübeyir Koşay and Remzi Oğuzarık, who had studied in Europe thanks to state funding and enjoyed full support by the Turkish state, would dig their spade in Anatolian soil. They were after the oldest civilization that could be found in the country, and they would look for it also with the support of the society, initially in Ahlatlıbel, Karalar and Gölüdağ, and after 1935 in Alacahoyuk, the Thracian Tumili, the Castle of Ankara, Çankırı Kapı, Etiyokuşu, Karaoğlan, Pazarlı, and Sarayburnu. From that point onwards, Turkish archaeology was at the service of a political agenda that aimed at justifying the borders concluded with the Lausanne Treaty and at forming a unified nation-state with prehistoric roots in Anatolia. And by means of conclusion, as we are short of time, even though the Ottoman regulation on antiquities remained in place, archaeology now came to serve a radically different cause than the one it had served in Ottoman times, with its affirmation of the multitude of civilizations in the empire and above all, the Greco-Roman past. Thank you.